Hello, I'm Elijah Rose, the soldier turned historian, and today's topic is Arabia as part of the Roman Empire. This first part is about Roman interests in the region and how and why they first entered into it. Now, the backstory is in the second and first centuries BC, the Romans would expand into the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, sometimes by alliance, sometimes by wars, and sometimes by both. Pompey the Great entered Jerusalem in 63 BC as part of the Third Mithridatic War, where he took the city from its Greek overlord. Julius Caesar conquered Egypt in 47 BC due to the Alexandrian Civil War, but it had been loosely part of the empire before that, and it was incorporated more into the empire after the war anyway. Both nations would become satellite states of Rome, with governors appointed by the emperor with authorities over matters, quote, concerning Rome, while the locals were allowed to maintain their own governments over local affairs and often their own currency and such too. Of course, in usual Roman fashion, protecting these vassal states would get them entangled in conflicts even farther away from Rome in ever growing expansion that seemed to have stopped in this area as it was the reach of Roman influence. But even so, the key term is the spice trade. Now, in the pre industrial war, transporting anything at all over long distance was both time consuming and very expensive. Obviously, you don't just need the pack animals or ships to move stuff, you need to pay the workers to spend weeks on the road moving it from point A to point B. Now, this has a big effect on what is perceived as a luxury item because many goods could only be grown in select area, and while it might be cheap where the product is created, it might be considered a luxury item at another location. To the point where some of these materials, these spices we're about to talk about, were traded for their own weight in gold. Although most were traded for their weight in copper or the weight in silver. And these spices included, but were not limited to, cinnamon, opium, coffee, sugar, cardamom, pepper, frankincense, myrrh, flower extracts, nutmeg, cloves, a whole lot of herbs, and many others. In exchange for these spices, manufactured goods from the cities like ships, metal tools, swords, new animal breeds, including European horses, and often the gold and silver coin itself flowed from wealthy empires to small and remote periods. In fact, Roman coins have even been found in India, and it's believed this is how they ended up there. Now, of course, one of the many things the Romans had in common with their European and American descendants is they heavily preferred to tax the rich. This is not just to lighten the admin costs because they're taxing fewer persons, but it meant enforcement was easier as there are fewer people to go after, and enforcement actions could recover larger sums, making it more worthwhile. And no one felt bad about relieving rich persons from a little of their money. Also, taxes paid to Rome by allegedly sovereign local governments was a hot button in politics at the time. In fact, the reason Caesar had to go to war with the Egyptians was because they refused to repay loans that they had been overdue to Rome for decades. And of course, the Judean Sanhedrin was openly arguing whether or not it was against Hebrew scripture to pay taxes to a pagan ruler and to use coins that had the face of a person. We also do have some account of what daily Roman bean counting looked like from a joke that circulated at the time. The story is a scholarly monk was traveling and he entered the Roman Empire and encountered the Roman border guards. As in modern times, the clerk told him to declare his goods and consent to a search. The monk was carrying nothing, so he simply listed off his personal virtues, and after he finished, the clerk just stared at him. And then the monk repeated, "It's just me and my virtues." And the clerk said, "I got all that, but where are the girls?" Of course, the joke is a pun that has to do with a Persian word that sounds like a Latin word, if I remember correctly. But in any case, You can see that custom and shore enforcement has actually not changed much in the so many centuries since Rome. Now, Roman rule into Arabia initially spread by alliance with the Nabateans, who were the Arabs of the northern Hejaz and southern Jordanian region. And of course, large towns spread up along the major trade routes, but there were actually two major trade routes involved. There was a European dominated sea route along the Red Sea, which was faster and cheaper, but required skilled sailors and big, expensive ships. And there was this overland route that ran the length of the Hijaz and into Yemen, which was far more intensive because it required men spending weeks on the road with smaller amounts of goods that were carried on camel trains, but it was open to impoverished and unskilled Arabs. So you actually can see, like in modern times, you see labor intensive industries being outsourced to third world, what we would call a third world country. During this period, hugely expensive mansions and graves were carved directly into the cliff faces that make up a whole lot of the ancient iconic ruins in Arabia, including the temple you saw featured on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That temple is actually in Petra, which was the largest city in Arabia at the time, and where the movie is based, not based on any real world location though, because the ruins they show in the movie were a few days ride at most from a city called Iskenderun. Eh, and the real world Petra is in southern Jordan, and Iskenderun is in Hatay in Turkey. But of course, for the movie, they just needed some giant, awesome ruins. You might have noticed that these spice towns had economies almost exactly identical to modern oil states in Arabia area today. These nations centered around small, remote cities with extremely high costs of living, and centered around small numbers of highly paid persons who were a mix of foreign skilled workers and local landlords. And of course, they lived surrounded by a semi nomadic population who had a near zero cost of living and competed for the handful of jobs available to them. The economy also centered around a handful of exports to a handful of locations where any one boycott from a handful of major trading partners could and would produce catastrophic national failure, i.e., there were only 120 ships that would pass through Yemen on to and from their moving goods to and from Roman controlled Egypt and Judea. And much of the local economy was in selling necessities to these travelers, like, food, medicine, and such. It shouldn't surprise you that the politics inside the spice states center around fighting for control of the spices themselves. Not just the trade routes, but physical control of the spices, where they would rob each other's caravans. But of course, the larger players were fighting over the control of the trade routes to form spice cartels, in much in the same way that governments in the same area today fight to form oil cartels, but generally fail to do so. Now, proxy battles formed as some of these Arab clans were allied to Rome, especially in the western sphere of influence, and some of these Arab clans were allied to Persia, mostly in the Gulf region. And the Romans called their section of the spice routes Arabia Felix, which means happy Arabia, because of their civilizing influence keeping the peace as best they could. Now, the immediate casus belli for the Roman invasion isn't actually given in any of the sources, other than to say that the Romans wanted to take direct control over the spice routes. Although it's not stated explicitly whether this is to form a spice cartel or prevent piracy raids from Persian proxies. It might be a combination of both. What we do know is Emperor Augustus Caesar ordered Egypt's governor Gaius Aelius Gallus to sail with 10,000 men into Arabia and drive out Rome's enemies from the spice roads. Now, this is a good case in point that basically all the maps of the quote Roman Empire aren't actually very good because Rome didn't actually have borders. Its powers were vast and nebulous because they had indirect control over cities so far away, but there were also cities inside Italy itself that were had at least a high degree of autonomy, if not they were officially sovereign. Indeed, you could argue that it was as vast and nebulous as the US federal government has today because they have limited authority over US states, which they can run directly, though, but they have this vast network of international treaty organizations where there are no rules, and so their reach can go all over the world. And of course, the Federals also guard the trade routes, including the ones in the same area today, where they get into completely unrelated proxy wars over the same trade routes today.